Secretary Olmer, members of the Council, and guests, it's a pleasure to welcome you this evening. We'd like to thank an anonymous corporate member for providing the reception this evening. We'd also like to remind you, of course, that the World Trade Center Institute was good enough to co-sponsor this program. I'd also like to remind you that our next guest will be Oleg Sokolov, the Minister Counselor or Deputy Ambassador of the Soviet Union to the United States, speaking on Soviet-American relations on the 7th of March. For a variety of reasons, our announcement of that event, our formal announcement, will be later than usual. So if you'd like, you can sign up at the table by the door on the way out for that particular program. Our trustee host this evening is Ambassador Fife Symington, who we're always delighted to have host one of our council events. Ambassador Symington, as all of you older members know, is one of those people who was so very, very essential to the founding of this organization in 1980. So it gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce our guest, Ambassador Fife Symington.
Thanks very much for being so complimentary, Frank. And good evening to you, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure on behalf of our council to welcome you as our guest. And I think it's particularly fitting. I don't have to waste many words and your time in telling you just how vital the question of trade is to the Port of Baltimore, the life of the community, and the life of Maryland. Sydney is a truism that since the time that John Smith sailed up the Chesapeake Bay, a little later followed by Mr. Claiborne, whose adherents claimed to founding the colony in spite of the St. Mary's group, that trade started then to be a major problem and a major focus of everyone's attention in Maryland. The two little islands, Palmer Island and one or two others up at the end of the bay, were held by fur traders, white fur traders who had come in, and they couldn't, because of the Indian situation, get much further up the Susquehanna. The Susquehannocks came down to trade furs with them. And the Chesapeake Bay has been the scene of trading action and fighting action over trade, and now verbal action over trade, locally, and of course with this tremendous port internationally. So it is wonderful for us to have a gentleman come from Washington, from the Department of Commerce, who is, of all people in the administration today, one of the major negotiators and one of the most knowledgeable people concerning international trade and commerce. And without further ado, I take the greatest pleasure in presenting to you Mr. Lionel H. Olmer, who is the Undersecretary of Commerce for International Trade.
Mr. Ambassador, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to be here at a time when I can look out the window and see something. I was here 2 years ago and all I saw was fog. What I hope to achieve after about 30 minutes of speaking will, I hope, not leave you in a fog, but provide sufficient fuel for questions that you may want to put to me on any subject area that I raise or that I don't. Running the International Trade Administration of the Department of Commerce is truly an exercise in the management of conflicting and competing objectives. Export promotion, for example, which is the job assignment of the majority of the 2,300 people that work for me in the United States and around the world is vital to our national economic health. On the other hand, import controls and export controls, I think, is vital for our national survival. I could have picked any one of those three topics and concentrated on them exclusively. I could have chosen U.S.-Soviet affairs in the context of commercial opportunities, and I'd be pleased to respond to questions on that score or any other. But for the purpose of the remarks in chief that I want to make, I decided that the subject to a group as potentially significant as is the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs, that I ought to take a much broader look at both the present and the prospective future course for the vitality of American trading interests. You know, from the time of sailing ships of pre-revolutionary America, the days of the great Baltimore Clippers, through the 1980s, with the exports of computers, telecommunications, aerospace, the United States has been a vigorous trading nation. I think it's wrong to say we haven't been internationally minded. I think it's wrong to say our business managers haven't been sufficiently far-sighted, nor have they developed the ability to deal overseas. They have, and America has benefited as a consequence of that. But the future of global trade now demands that we navigate beyond what some would say are shoals and rocks of protectionism and steer into the waters of interdependence, which is marked by ever-increasing liberalization of what have been closed world markets. I'd like to describe the nature of this global interdependence and the importance of trade to the United States economy. I'd like to give you my view of protectionism, somewhat different from, I think, the conventional. A peek at U.S.-Japan relations. I leave tomorrow morning for my second trip to Japan in 3 weeks, and to perhaps describe what I see as a future course for America, for America's trading interests. The value of free world, that is, the entire world less the Soviet Union and the East Bloc, of free world exports has grown dramatically in the last 10 years, from roughly $282 billion in 1970 to nearly $2 trillion in 1982. Today, the United States and others live with that fact that their national economies are interdependent. The more advanced a nation's economy, the more dependent it is on others. Self-sufficiency is no longer a compatible goal with a modern industrial state or the desire to achieve modernity, no matter how much any may admire the ideal of independence. National economies are but fractional components of the world system. 25%, for example, of everything produced in the world is sold across national boundaries. 70% of everything sold in America competes against products from other countries. Financing, production, and marketing are increasingly inadequate and uncompetitive unless they're done on a worldwide basis. For example, the world's financial system sends billions of dollars from Europe to Asia and back again within seconds via electronic means in pursuit of investment returns. Computer telecommunication systems are making both information and financing available instantaneously worldwide. Engineers and businessmen in Latin America and in Asia have access to the latest technology, to the latest production techniques, and to financing. Nations, therefore, can create now, as they have never been able to do, their own comparative advantage. Competition is indeed global. Investments in world financial markets are at least 10 times greater than annual world trade, a staggering number, even larger than the cumulative total of world debt. We're also seeing the emergence of joint ventures on a world scale which do transcend national economic policies. Just two examples. One, the AT&T Philips of the Netherlands agreement to sell digital telephone switching equipment for networks outside the United States, and a recent Hitachi of Japan and Burroughs of the United States agreement in the new field of fiber optic communication cables. Most producers of computers and telecommunications components are linked through networks of technology exchange agreements, which include shared production of components, the manufacture of brand name devices for marketing under domestic identification, and the new phenomena of cooperative research and development activities. One of Germany's foremost companies in the field of computers is almost out of the computer manufacturing business, but you'd never know it. It sells a very healthy amount of computers in Europe under its name, but all of them are made in Japan. This means, and that's not an unusual phenomenon, it's one that's increasing. I just hope that we don't fall into that. That's something for later. This means that today, all countries are linked. For example, a product which combines communication and equipment technology could easily include, in fact almost inevitably does include, a video display unit manufactured in Korea, a printer manufactured in Japan, components assembled in Malaysia, a disk drive manufactured in Singapore, and perhaps a microcomputer manufactured in the United States. International trade has fared better in recent years than the domestic economies of industrial countries and has created more jobs than its costs. And I'd like to put that sentence at the end of the foregoing paragraph to tell you that I approve of this interdependence. It is a source of the vitality that free trade has enjoyed in the last decade. In the United States, exports now account for 20% of our industrial production and for 40% of our agricultural output. And as I hope everyone in this audience knows, exports do create jobs. We estimate that for every $1 billion of exports, about 25,000 jobs are created, new jobs are created in this country. In the last 5 years, more than 80% of the new jobs created in manufacturing, a total of nearly 5 million, were all export related. A report by the Business International Corporation published last May shows that the greater the intensity of foreign investment, the fewer jobs are lost in the United States. The study looked at the performance of 55 manufacturers and 3 oil companies with worldwide sales of $300 billion and over an 11-year period looked at them. The report found that those firms investing most outside the United States increased employment in the United States by 12%. Firms who invested less outside the United States decreased employment in the United States by 2.5%. So much for that base canard, as the French would say, that exports cost American jobs. Other findings in this survey include sales outside the United States grew much faster, about 400%, compared with sales to U.S. customers, which were only up 256%. It sounds pretty good except in comparison. Exports totaled about $33 billion, representing 29% of all U.S. manufacturers' exports in 1981. The trade surplus for the sample of the manufacturing companies was even more dramatic, rising from $4.6 billion in 1970 to $25.5 billion in 1981. Now, I like to say, and I would have said in response to a question about the nature of our economy, I'm not an economist, I'm an honest man. That's about the last number I'm going to burden you with. Let's talk a little bit about protectionism. We really never have depended so much on exports and on overseas markets for growth in this country as we do today. And yet, just when it's important for us to continue the pursuit of the world's ideal of open and free trade, protectionist sentiment is heard across the country, and it's growing. I personally do not share the pessimism over the trade prospects, nor do I perceive that protectionism will take hold, despite a widely shared view that it will. However, interdependence has done more than anything else to stimulate fierce and increasingly unfriendly trade competition. Some of it, perhaps much of it, depending on your perspective, unfair. It brings me to the importance of international codes and international negotiations. The official position of your government, not just this administration, but for several administrations removed, the official position is and will remain that we must build on and maintain international procedures and institutions. They indeed are the great international wheels on which the commerce of many nations will move. Without arrangements like the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or the GATT as it's called, or other institutions such as the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, based in Paris, made up of some 24 nations, or the International Monetary Fund, there would be no standards of fairness against which to measure fair behavior, no knowledge of how to pursue a grievance, no medium of exchange, and no way to draw lessons from the past. However, the multilateral negotiation effort is necessarily long, arduous, frustrating, and highly unlikely to yield fast, positive results reflected in the bottom line of any individual successful cooperation in the near term. We must have patience and perseverance. That's difficult to get across to a corporation which is not satisfied with the speed at which agreements are reached on liberalizing markets and on resolving trade disputes. There is a place for bilateralism, nation-to-nation negotiation, both in terms of promoting increased access to markets, increasing access to technology and sharing of technology, and to streamlining problem resolution, customs inspection, the certification of medical equipment. An example where bilateralism is working is the United States and Japan. Outside of Canada, Japan is America's biggest international customer, and the United States is Japan's biggest trading partner. In foodstuffs, forestry products, electronics, and a whole range of manufactured goods, our trade relation is vigorous and is growing. Because of this extraordinary high degree of interdependence between our two economies, some aspects of trade relations between the United States and Japan are troubled. The sources of the frictions are complex. I think it's almost inevitable given the size of the account between us. But the heart of the matter, I think, was summed up by President Reagan in his recent speech to to the Japanese diet when he said that Americans believe that the U.S. market is more open than is the Japanese market. And I think that strikes at the heart of the problem for us and for most Americans, the perception of inequality. A leading Japanese newspaper, the Yomiuri Shimbun, and the Gallup organization, not too long ago, conducted a nationwide poll to determine Japanese and American public views on protectionism. The results of the poll showed that 2/3 of the Americans saw at least some progress in opening Japanese markets to imports. However, the Japanese were somewhat more divided about their own performance. At least 1/3 saw little or no progress. The fundamental issue is one of simple equity. The U.S. feels that Japan must understand that Americans must have open access to markets in Japan, both financial markets and trade markets. Japan has not yet opened up, but we are making headway. Our efforts at opening up the nearly $4 billion in purchases made by the Nippon Telegraph and Telephone Public Corporation, in lowering Japanese investment regulations, and in establishing a high-technology working group that really works, are only the beginning of a long process by which we hope to establish a relatively open and equitable situation for our businessmen in the Japanese marketplace. Throughout our negotiations with Japan, and indeed with all of our trading partners, the policy of the Reagan administration is formed around a fundamental principle of open trade. The principle is, when it is not absolutely essential to restrict or impede trade, it is absolutely essential not to do so. I am impressed by the determination of the Japanese government, from Prime Minister Nakasone throughout his cabinet, reaching into the professional bureaucracy, to do some things differently in the last half of the 1980s. But we'll have to watch it and cultivate it and call to their attention those occasions when we do not believe our suppliers, our investors, our financial people are not getting a fair shake. Although the U.S. trade deficit was around $70 billion this last year, in 1984 it could reach $100 billion. Astonishing. They happen to be, however, looking at the bright side, a major factor contributing to the world's economic recovery. Indeed, our open markets have added 1/2 percentage point to the entire rest of the world's gross national product in 1983. The causes of our trade difficulties, of our deficit, are roughly threefold. The strong dollar and relative U.S. competitiveness, which isn't very good as a consequence. Problems in the less developed countries of the world at managing their debt problems in particular. And strong growth in the United States as we are recovering, which leads to increasing demand for foreign products. Now, we don't want to reduce our economic recovery simply to reduce our trade deficit, and we won't. But there are areas that require and are receiving key attention and action. The appreciation of the dollar brings with it a trade-weighted value of up to 30% since the end of 1980, and that 30% increase has impaired the ability of American industries to compete with foreign companies, both overseas and in the U.S. marketplace. By cutting their profit margins, some companies are able to hang on, but I know they can't do so indefinitely. Some forecasters attribute about half of our trade deficit to the strength of the dollar, roughly $35 billion. Increasingly, the United States has turned to developing countries for export markets. By 1982, the United States was sending about 40% of our manufactured exports to developing countries, more than to any single market. But recently, our exports to these markets, recently meaning in the last 18 months, have been shrinking rapidly, and we have felt the pinch as a consequence very directly. In the first 6 months of 1983, exports to the 8 high-debt Latin American countries, Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, Peru, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, and Venezuela, fell by nearly 37% compared to the previous year. A surplus position enjoyed by us in many of those countries has been turned into a deficit. The developing countries' inability to import has a more severe impact on the U.S. trade deficit picture than the high dollar, if you can believe it. Of the $25 billion drop in U.S. manufacturers' goods balance last year, $19 billion of that, or more than 3/4 of the total deterioration, arose because of import restraints in Latin America. That could have represented roughly 500,000 jobs for American workers, lost because of trade restrictions imposed because of the economic adjustments made necessary in Latin America. Industrial countries can help restore economic growth in the developing world through rebuilding their own economies so that we'll continue to be a strong market for their exports of basic commodities. We need to resist protectionism and to allow for increased U.S. Markets for these LDCs as our recovery takes hold. We've done it so far, and I think we've got to continue doing it, even in certain areas where it is painful to do so. We also have to provide adequate financing for U.S. companies to export into the less developed world. That financing has evaporated because of scares created for some very real reasons, but nonetheless scares. And that prevents the creation of U.S. markets, or markets for U.S. goods, as these economies in Latin America are beginning to grow. We are working in the administration, both multilaterally and bilaterally, to stabilize these financial flows. We're trying to take measures to provide those developing countries with export credits and with support for the importation of U.S. goods. Not long ago, the Export-Import Bank of the United States approved 2 export credit insurance facilities for Brazil and Mexico totaling $2 billion. A very novel program on the part of the Ex-Im Bank. It is for short-term, generally speaking, low dollar-sized project meant for rapid turnaround to aid and to facilitate the export of U.S. goods on a more regular basis than has been possible in the last 2 years. We have a lot of hopes for even that $2 billion. If it can get recycled twice or 3 times in a year, it could mean support for $6 or $8 billion worth of American goods. But the private sector has got to do more, much more, than it has come to be doing in the last 2 years. Bank lending to Latin America increased less than $4 billion in the first half of 1983 compared to $33 billion in 1981. From $33 billion to $4 billion. That drop is making the adjustment process much more difficult in Latin America, since their interest payments on their external debt have far more than doubled since 1979. With regard to long-term U.S. competitiveness, I think the current attention being paid to the challenges we face is healthy, necessary and healthy. It's a first step for the United States to recognize that it's a new ballgame for American companies. Slow growth is going to intensify the competition for export markets. I mean, slow growth in the developed world. Our estimates reveal that the industrial world's real GNP will grow only about 2.5% a year into the 1990s, fully a third less than during most of the post-war period. The U.S. is going to be one of the fastest growing of those economies, a reversal of what happened in the 1960s and 70s. That's great news, except for our trade balance, which is going to continue to show deficits. Europe is going to see double-digit unemployment and is going to face the need for wrenching social reforms in their welfare systems, in their outmoded industries, and in their employment rules. Some European countries may well opt for protectionism. Some have opted for protectionism in an attempt to protect jobs. Japan is going to continue to run huge trade surpluses, and Japan and Europe will both increase efforts to outmaneuver the United States in the high technology area. The LDCs at the same time will be pressing even more forcefully for a sharply increased share of world trade in low-tech manufacturers. A week doesn't go by that I don't get an official letter request or a private request from either a foreign manufacturer or his government asking for a guaranteed share of a particular American market in the product he has to offer. I can't accept it. Our future course, our future direction, our strategy is to challenge existing and emerging market barriers. We're going to seek a new round, a new multilateral round of trade negotiations. We'll continue to attempt to strengthen the gap. It needs it. We're going to resist legislation in the Congress. There are now 89 pieces of protectionist legislation before the Congress of the United States. Now, the vast majority of it is there because it's an election year, and the congressmen well know that it appeals to many of their constituents. There are not many constituents who sound the gong for free trade. Many don't even care whether it's fair or free. We will resist those, and I believe we're going to be successful at it. At the same time, we're going to continue to vigorously enforce our trade laws, our anti-dumping and countervailing duty laws. We have to draw the distinction between unfair trade and protectionism. The use of our anti-dumping and countervailing duty laws is not protectionism. Last year we had 175 different complaints from a variety of American industries, many of which were quite heart-wrenching in the tale of woe they describe as to what unfair foreign competition has done to their segments of the American marketplace. The private sector needs to continue promoting efficiency and innovation. You know, U.S. unit labor costs have increased far more than overseas, and our productivity has slipped. You can't compete with foreign steel from LDCs when your unit labor costs are roughly $23, $25 an hour, and foreign labor costs are around $3 an hour. It won't work. We need to continue promoting tax policies that will stimulate investment in new plant and equipment, and we need to increase R&D. By the way, I'm not suggesting that we reduce our labor cost to $3 an hour. We need to reduce the regulatory burden and increase, I'll leave that to people in the steel marketing end of the steel industry. We need to reduce the regulatory burden and to increase the mobility of capital and of ideas. Policies which facilitate cooperative research and development. 2 years ago, an American genius in the field of computers came to me and described an idea he had for the creation of a cooperative research and development facility, bringing together 15 American companies who would do basic research in microelectronics, not with any intent of marketing an individual product, but pooling basic research efforts. I thought it was just a humdinger of an idea. He went to the Justice Department and they kind of told him they'd have to look carefully at what resulted and that they might let him do it, but it might, on the other hand, be a violation of antitrust and everyone could go to jail. Well, this fellow is a true entrepreneur and a genius, not merely in the scientific and academic sense. He's a risk taker. And he says, I think I've got a winner. The hell with him. Let him try. And he went ahead and he did it. And he's got a facility. I think Maryland was one of the states which bid to have the company locate in Maryland. It lost to Austin, Texas. And there's a facility that's going up there for a lot of reasons, which I'd be happy to respond to in questions. And those 15 companies are contributing some of their best people, some of their top dollars, and they've got some very interesting projects that are off and running. The Justice Department still has not given him a guarantee against antitrust liability. In 1983, the United States had a $21 billion surplus in high technology trade. But you know, that was $9 billion less than we had just 3 years before. We've got to do better in that area as well. I also think that we need more effective governmental support to American exporters. The U.S. national trade posture would be more coordinated, in our view, in the President's view, if we could consolidate all federal trade departments into a single cabinet-level agency, rather than the current situation with trade offices spread all over Washington. If you want to reach a decision on any given matter, you have to subject it to what is euphemistically known as the interagency process. And it usually means they went that way. Everyone is there to capture attention for decisions which are applauded, and nobody's home when it's time to accept responsibility for those times when we don't do the right thing. We want to put trade promotion and trade policy and finance, everything in one place. I had a report submitted to me by one of our young and very effective commercial officers working in Saudi Arabia, in which he compared the approaches taken by Japanese exporters in Saudi Arabia to American exporters in Saudi Arabia. It's not quite classified, but it does say some things which I think would be better left unsaid and widely circulated note. But I'm going to, as we say, sanitize it and then give it wide circulation, because it's immensely instructive. Japanese company goes into Saudi Arabia and they get out of the main cities. They come equipped with financial types, and they come equipped with people who can make decisions on the spot. More often than not, the American spends more time selecting the right hotel room with the best view. He doesn't have financial support with him. He's got to check with the home office. Doesn't have the ability to make final the terms of sale, this aftermarket service, reliability in terms of maintenance, or the ability to describe the financing package which would be available to the Arabians. Notwithstanding all that, our officer in Riyadh says, all's not lost, they like us. You begin to wonder why. The President has proposed to the Congress a single department of industry and trade, and I must say it's languishing in the Congress of the United States, including on the desk of your great senator, my great senator, Charles Mathias. And I have to believe that it is not all substance that causes that bill to be in a constipated state. In fact, at a Chamber of Commerce meeting, a corporate chief executive asked a congressman Well, what will happen to you, sir, if this new department is created? And the congressman, who is a good friend and a very honest man, not an economist, he's a lawyer such as I am, he said, if I lose my job, the jurisdiction will move from my committee to another, but that's not the only reason I'm against it. In the Commerce Department's International Trade Administration, we have begun a new effort, notwithstanding the lack of a piece of legislation to do so, to assess our international competitiveness on an industry-by-industry basis. We think it's going to provide the business community and the political leadership a better means of planning their growth and their policy strategies. Other key efforts include, from our point of view, a more full implementation of the Export Trading Company Act, which President Reagan signed into law in November of 1982. There are about 18 licensed ETCs, which does provide for an antitrust exemption and does permit ownership by banks. We know that there will be a second surge. The big banks have finally decided to enter. B of A and Chase have joined. Sears World Trade and a number of others are not, well, I've also joined, and a number of others are not far behind. We're going to begin a major second round of promotional activity within the next couple of months. I think the Export-Import Bank needs to do more than it has, and we're going to press it to do just that in this coming year. We've got to do more to convince our trading partners to raise their interest rates closer to market rates. We've done some good work in that regard, but we need to go a long way further, perhaps by providing an automatic lift and not waiting for an annual negotiation to take place, during which period, by the way, our foreign competition gets a huge edge on its American counterpart. In conclusion, I'd like to say that America must compete. There is no choice. Our economic future depends on it. The real issue isn't whether we'll adjust to the world's changing trade patterns, but when and how. We have to keep trade channels open and operating fairly for all nations in order to help ourselves. That's the task of government, and the outlook is, I'd say, cautiously optimistic. But even that, government help, is not enough. You, those of you in the business community, and others with a stake in it, and that means almost every single American, has got to strengthen national awareness of the importance of a free and open international trade system. Our future demands that we move ourselves and our trading partners to prosperity through that mechanism, and I think we will. Thank you very much.
Well, we certainly thank you for a nicely crafted, comprehensive, and clear presentation. The Secretary is open to questions until 10 minutes after 7.
Mr. Secretary, I'm in the field, so I get the brunt of some of the paradoxes that seem to exist. We're in a so strong
Than at any time in our history. The evidence is persuasive that our campaign to let people know about the profits to be made in international trade, about the increased jobs that will result from being competitive, about the essentiality of not meeting merely domestic competition but international competition, is demonstrating real results. I appreciate what you say about conflicting signals. I started my talk by saying that the management of ITA, which I head, is a study in managing conflict and competition. And I don't mean competition in a business sense. Someone has once said, if they didn't, I'll say it, the only certainty is death and taxes. You would not, I would hope, urge us to permit the export of the latest sophisticated computer system to the Soviet Union at the same time whether you support the present Defense Department budget or some smaller proportion thereof. At the same time, we're spending the nation's treasure and sending our young men and women into the armed forces into potentially dangerous situations when the Soviets are using that mechanism to...
Get it elsewhere.
That's not true. I mean, sure, there are mistakes made in the course of developing a technology list that is far too pervasive. I've said for the public record, Secretary Baldridge has said for the public record, that our control list is at least twice as large as it ought to be. But twice as large as it ought to be doesn't mean it ought to be zero. And what's implicit in what you say is an unwillingness to support our national security because of the fear of lost sales. And I don't think that's right. Now, if you want to talk about foreign policy controls, let's talk about it. The President lifted the grain embargo that Carter imposed because of Afghanistan. Some in the administration didn't even agree with it, but he made that decision because it was a campaign promise. On the other hand, was the invasion of Afghanistan, was the threat to Poland to be ignored? Were we just supposed to say some hollow words? We have, for example, a foreign policy that does substantially restrain American exporters from selling into South Africa. As a matter of fact, I think it is having some effect on the ability of the South Africans to maintain an apartheid program. I happen to believe that they are gradually changing. I don't think it's fast enough. I don't think it is right and proper, and I support that boycott. There are those that would say that's a severe restraint. They can get it anywhere. And in the case of South Africa, clearly they can get it anywhere. We're not talking just high technology. We're talking about anything that would be sent to a police or a military unit. A year and a half ago, we wouldn't even allow a first aid kit to a traffic patrolman who didn't even have, a black traffic patrolman who didn't even have the power of arrest because he was identified with apartheid policies. We have an anti-boycott policy that's an adjunct to the Export Administration Act, which you criticize. That anti-boycott policy it does act as an impediment to American exports. We don't want to change that. That law is part of our land. It was passed by a vote of every single member of the Congress. Now, those 535 courageous souls did not raise a hand in opposition in 1977, I think. I have to believe that that is fairly representative of the constituents that they represent. And we do support that. And no one pretends that that policy is going to change Arab behavior towards Israel. That doesn't make it any less worthwhile. You've picked out an area you happen to agree with, but I submit to you there are areas that I'll bet if we had a quiet conversation you'd support. Notwithstanding all of that, the list is too big. We make too many mistakes. We shouldn't make them. We're doing a better job. We're doing a better job in the boycott area. In this administration, I'd point out to you, we've collected about 4 times the amount of fines that were collected in 4 years of the Carter administration. We did that in the first 3. So, next question. Sorry for getting a little worked up. Yes.
Shouldn't we change to the metric system in order to create large jobs and to make American products more available and accessible to the rest of the world? It's on the metric system.
I think so, but I shudder to think of what it'll do to me. There's a wonderful cartoon that appeared in the London Financial Times that showed an English woman, an old woman, in bed with the covers over her head, and obviously a maid comes in and says, "What's up?" And she said, "They've changed to the metric system, and I'm staying here till it all blows over." Sure we should. But companies who are, larger companies who are actively involved in international trade do have a way of meeting that sort of competition. I think they're doing it, but I do believe that our direction should be that way, and I don't think we're moving there fast enough. I agree. Back to them.
You mentioned before that you should not follow policy of protectionism unless it's absolutely necessary. When does that time have to be necessary?
Well, it depends, of course, on your definition of protectionism. I'm wrestling with a case right now involving what some say is national security. National security, an industry which is identified as national security. What does that mean? It means that the United States has got to have some capacity in that given industry to respond to crises. You know, we may one day go to war. It's a horrible thought. I don't like to conceive of it, but there's an awful lot of money being spent as insurance. A, that we don't have to, but if we do, that we're prepared to. Now, if you do that, you have to have a variety of products, a variety of manufacturing facilities that are able to respond. In my judgment, it would be warranted to take a limited protectionist action if an industry identified as national security were threatened with survival because of foreign exports to the United States. Now, oftentimes we have available to us import control laws. I mentioned anti-dumping and countervailing duty, which are not protectionist, which say if a company sells below fair value, or if a company sells with the aid of its government providing its subsidies so that the competition isn't real, you can stop it. And we have stopped a great deal of that. We have another body of law which says if an industry is really injured as a consequence of imports, foreign imports into the United States, that you can remedy it by imposing limits on further imports. You declare it protectionist, and then you tell your trading partners, look, I had to do this. I had to do it, and I may regret it. I'm willing to pay you in another area. So we, for example, about 6 months ago, in a very, very difficult decision the President took, in the area of specialty steel, this is the sort of the high technology part of the U.S. steel industry, said it needed protection. A limited degree of protection was provided, quotas were established, and the quotas were allocated. The European community said, we don't think that's enough. We want more. And the United States said, that's all we're going to give you. The Europeans said, then we're going to retaliate against you by increasing our tariffs on your exports of shoe polish and toothpaste. I don't remember exactly what they said. And we've disputed that in this General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade forum in Geneva, Switzerland. And we may lose. If we lose, it will increase the tariffs on those products, and it will cost the U.S. exporters of those products some degree of competitiveness. Those are the limits. I mean, it's not, the answer is a seminar. That's a short answer to an extremely complicated question. Yes, sir.
There's no question that you're subject to a great deal of complex problems. And I have a lot of questions in mind, but because of the time, I like to limit it to just one or two. The government recently entered into an agreement with Japan to limit the import or export of Japanese cars. The criticism to that agreement was that it limited the number of cars in this country to American citizens, causing the Japanese cars to have a high price, and also enabled the American automobile manufacturer to raise the price of their car without regard to cost effectiveness. Would you care to comment on that?
The voluntary agreement was originally negotiated 3 years ago, a little under 3 years ago, for the purpose of giving Detroit so-called breathing room, a respite from Japanese competition so it could retool and become more competitive and stand on its own. That was the rationale. It was understood at the time that there would be a price to others in the American economy. And you've identified a couple of them, but not all of them. There are more. Question of whether or not that was a wise action, I think, is revealed in the testimony of the automobile companies in reporting on their wages. They are getting better They are getting better, not just as a consequence of the limit of 1.68 billion, but by a number of actions that they've taken that probably they couldn't have taken unless they had some degree of assurance that they'd turn profitable in 1982, 1983. For example, no country in the world permits an industry so basic to its economy as the automobile sector is to this. 500,000 jobs. It touches every aspect, glass, rubber, textiles, you name it. No country in the world permits as open a market as we have in this country. In France, less than 3% of the car market is permitted to be foreign. And they do it by an interesting way of just refusing to admit cars for the purpose of inspecting them. In Italy, it's less than 3%. In Germany, that paragon of virtue that lectures everyone who will stand still for it on the virtues of free trade, I said, well, you tell me you've grown from 5 to 10%. Suppose in the next 2 years it grows from 10 to 20. What will you do then? They said, well, we're for free trade. Well, bananas they are. As soon as it began to get up to that level, they had some quiet talks of their own. The point is that if we didn't stop it then, the 23% in the judgment of some would have risen to 40%. And at 40%, I think you could be assured that Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler would not have survived. Well, GM would have survived, but the other two's future, I think, would have been in doubt. And it wouldn't be just the auto companies. It would be the suppliers to the auto companies. I've been running trade missions to Japan, well, from the private sector for a little bit, in this job for 3 years. They will not buy American auto parts, and they tell to be shipped to Japan. They're now investing in the United States, which I think is a good thing. They're beginning to buy some American parts, which I think is a good thing. They're making more money, which is a good thing. I don't like the cost, the ripple effect of that cost, and I do agree. You know, the short answer used to be that the protectionist action is inflationary. You can't use that argument when we've had such a dramatic reduction of inflation, however. Yes, sir.
Well, I have two questions for you. On the lighting side, what makes you think the lawyers are more honest than economists?
Personal experience.
On the serious side, this is sort of a crazy idea, but why you don't think about the idea of barter instead of avoiding hard feelings? Let that the international trade volume, aggregate volumes of countries vis-a-vis other countries go up or down simultaneously. So if you have a surplus 1 year, let them buy more next year. Until then, they wouldn't be selling more.
The subject of barter is receiving a great deal more attention than it ever has, and it's going to receive a great deal more attention than even in the last year or so, because of the shortage of hard cash. And the official policy of the government is to discourage barter because it does distort trade for a variety of reasons. It separates the ultimate customer from his supplier. It sometimes causes a company that wants to sell a product to sell it twice. He's got to sell his product, and then he's got to sell his customer's product, and he doesn't know anything at all about it. I've run into that in Europe with an American chemical company wanted to sell paint to Romania, and in return for the paint had to sell some kind of widget that he didn't know anything at all about. He took a beating. I do think that the proper place in which barter is handled is through the trading company concept. I have no objection to the growth of that. In fact, I see it's inevitable. We have objections to it if it's forced on people. In other words, if I buy your butter cookies, you have to take my semiconductors. We think that that's wrong. But I agree with you. It certainly is the way of the future. Back in the room.
I assume that the war you were referring to was a rerun of Part 1 or 2 and not 3. My question is this. Is anything being done now, or in your opinion, could or should it be done to increase trade with the Russians and Chinese?
Oh, an enormous amount's being done with China. Very, very positive results. It's another speech I make. I think the opportunities for American businessmen are enormous in the China market. Chinese are going to continue to have major difficulties developing their economy over the next many years. They've got 1 billion mouths to feed, and that's going to pose immense problems for them. But they have, at the same time, immense needs for infrastructure. The president is going to China at the end of April, or sometime in April, and it will be a return visit to Premier Zhao Ziyang's visit to the United States. Things are looking up. Things are looking up in high technology trade with China. Things are looking up in the development of oil and gas resources off the China shores. A lot of American companies are involved in that. Things are looking up in the development of basic industries in China, where American companies are providing the technology in hydropower, coal, steel making, and so on. So I think that that's quite desirable. In the case of the Soviet Union, it's another matter. I think that trade can be a precursor to improved relations, and I'd like to make it so. We have a couple of different trade councils between the United States and the USSR. They've been moribund in the last few years because of our basic political relationship. I'm one of those that hopes that the new regime of Chernenko will result in a more accommodating relationship with the United States, and that will, of itself, be cause for increasing trade between us. The early 1970s saw a lot of high expectations raised for trade with the Soviet Union. The era of détente created an image of immense markets in the Soviet Union, and it never materialized. At the heyday of détente, we exported less than $700 million worth of manufactured goods. I think a great deal more could be, but the Soviet Union's got large problems of its own in terms of available hard currency. It doesn't want to give that up except for the procurement of the kinds of things it can't make by itself, such as machines with which to run air defense systems. Those air defense systems are not there to route commercial traffic taking tourists in and out of Moscow. To answer your question about potential for hostilities. The largest land army in the world isn't there to operate a customs service. Yes.
In relation to wages and profits, is there any thinking in the part of the government regarding the controls there?
Oh, I would say absolutely not, but now you're getting into the area that honest men don't move. You know, if I may, at a recent May Day parade, not the one during Andropov's reign, but during Brezhnev's period, the Soviet defense minister, Dmitry Ustinov, and Brezhnev were standing next to each other, and they were watching this might go by. Cannons, rockets, God knows what. Awesome. And soldiers, sailors, Soviet Marines. And all of a sudden, Brezhnev spotted one group of people dressed better than everybody else. And he turned to Ustinov and he said, "Comrade Marshal, who are those people and why are they dressed better than everyone else? They stand out. Shiny buttons, spiffy helmets, their uniforms fit." And Ustinov said, "They are our economists." And Brezhnev said, "What are economists doing in the midst of our combat forces?" Ustinov said, "Ah, Comrade Chairman, President, you'd be surprised at the damage they can do."
But in the future, do you see that as now, as industry is starting to falter and they're having other problems as far as high unemployment, the cost is astronomical to financial research and development, and part of the reason that France and have taken that lead in telecommunications is because they have a centralized government where it subsidizes its businesses not only for exporting but also for research and development and innovation. But my question is as we have now lost the lead in the telecommunications field, we must jump the gun into the next stage or area in which the government does provide a certain amount of money for space exploration if that's the next era. But my question is, do you feel in the future, as far as what happened with the government subsidizing or helping Chrysler bail out for the automation industry, will businesses have to, since businesses want the government to stay out, fight for us to maintain that lead, will government have to start subsidizing our businesses in order to jump ahead in telecommunications?
I don't believe so. In the first place, I don't believe the government will do it. I don't believe the government should do it. And I don't believe the government needs to do it. I believe that our telecommunications industry is far superior to any telecommunications industry anywhere in the world. You try making a telephone call in Europe, especially in France. Well, I shouldn't say that because of the AT&T divestiture. You know, when I'm asked on a policy level, what do I think of it, I say, ask my wife about making a telephone call when the phone breaks. Whom do you call to repair it? But seriously, our telecommunications industry, our high technology industry, in most areas remains supreme. We are being severely challenged in some areas of high tech. We're being challenged in telecommunications, but I think we're still number one. France has got enormous difficulties facing it, and I'd like to say that their approach through a centralized socialist government has led to one disaster after another. They have poured more money into less productive projects than is conceivable. Never have so few given so much for so little. On the other hand, there's a lot that the U.S. government can do, should do, and I think will do. It ought to remove the regulatory burden that confronts people like this fellow I referred to. I ought to tell you his name. It's Bill Norris, the chairman and founder of Control Data Corporation. I think he's roughly 65, 70 years old now, who was one of the first designers of a supercomputer. Company's first class, very competitive. We need to remove the regulatory burden. We need to relax antitrust. We need to provide tax incentives for corporations to invest in R&D. And we need to permit, or we need to encourage the formation of these kinds of joint venture activities. I, for one, don't believe that our bias against anti-competitive policies has yet been accurately articulated for the 1980s. When the Sherman-Clayton Act was passed at the turn of the century, and it was robber barons against TR, we were looking at something quite different than we are today. We're looking at a truly international market, and I think the Justice Department and others who interpret the antitrust laws and intentions have to look at the changed nature of the world trading system. It's an international market they confront, an international market share that ought to be looked at. You remove those so-called disincentives, you get out of the way of the American entrepreneurial spirit in high technology, and you just watch out and beat the pants off of anybody I've ever met. I happen to have worked for a high-tech company before I got this job, and I believe that that company, as well as most others, will prevail if that situation pertains. Yes.
Yes, I teach international trade here in Baltimore, and I coordinate the Community College of Baltimore's international trade program. I wouldn't be able to do it without the ITA here in Baltimore. It would be impossible. My students use the Commerce Department. Many of my students have gone on to be exporters because of our unique program with documentation, export, import, marketing, instead of concentrating always on investment, as the other schools here in Baltimore, my God, do. Trade is what's important here in Baltimore. My question is, what do we do without the Mary Conrads? And what do we do without the trade specialists in cities that don't have ITAs, cities that don't have ports, cities that have never seen a ship, cities that don't know what a foreign freight forwarder is, but have a product that can be exported, but they don't have a school that teaches international trade, and they don't have the money, they don't have the grants? What happens to them?
Well, last year we put on some 3,500 seminars, 80% of them in small and medium-sized cities across America. We reversed the assignment, the tasks given to our district officers, and said that the majority of their time ought to be spent getting out instead of waiting for the phone to ring. We've done a lot of those things, and these seminars are held in cities that I've attended many of them, and I do find a great deal of interest by a wide variety of people, bankers, manufacturers, freight forwarders, insurance handlers, and so on. They're very interested in it. We charge them a nominal amount and give them a lunch for it.
People already in business.
No, there are a lot. No, as I say, the statistics show that more and more people, from the small and medium-sized business community are entering the field.
What about the people who aren't in it yet? What about the freshmen?
So
and
new to entry, new to market, and new to export, both. I'll bet you get the numbers from the district office.
What I mean is some people just study business administration, or some people are English majors, and some people, they don't get to be about 30 years old, and then they think about exporting. What about the young people that could be exporting now? We don't reach them in these sort of seminars. They're in school, they're in college. That's the place.
What do you want them to export?
Yeah. Okay, we're talking brokerage and that kind of thing too. We're not talking just manufacturers. We're talking about in some places where high technology is not synonymous with trade to me. It's more than
No, of course not. Of course not.
Fashion is high technology, isn't it? Just 5 SIC numbers.
Well, of course not. But I don't think that anything we do or I've suggested is to be limited to high technology. We've got one book that, as a matter of fact, had a new-to-market product, which was a self-tattoo system. And I just caught the exporting officer in my building up short. What are you doing? And he said, it's somebody with a better mousetrap, mixing parables.
Mr. Undersecretary, just a quick question. Do you feel that it's antipathetic to your free trade, the government's free trade policies that we advocate, to boycott trade with South Africa for political reasons? And does the boycotting of trade with South Africa hurt that objective of free trade, particularly since it creates tremendous unemployment in South Africa?
Well,
when our firms can't operate.
I understand the question, and I have a very clear answer. I do not believe in an absolute boycott. I believe in a carrot and stick, and I believe that our policy is correct. I believe that the boycott is something that is right and proper. Yes, it conflicts with the absolute ideal of free trade. Sure it does. But almost anything you do is in conflict with something else you're required to do. The antitrust law is in conflict with the ideal of pushing for joint research and development. A tax policy which rewards consumption and penalizes savings is ultimately a disincentive to export. The Arab boycott of Israel is something that I think most Americans find abhorrent. And the question is, what ought the government to do about it? And there's an awful lot of room for argument in that respect. I believe that foreign policy export controls indeed are justifiable even when they will not achieve the desired end result. I believe that there are some policies the government of the United States ought to stand up for and say it wants to distance itself from, no matter the cost. I mean, short of perhaps not even including war sometimes. But you do that, and you're willing to pay the price, and you tell your constituents that's what you've done. As I said, The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act also passed by a unanimous vote of the Congress of the United States. And it said not that we penalize those who support bribery and corruption, but we'll even penalize a guy who doesn't understand that you can't give $10 to a customs agent to facilitate the entry of your product. Now, in some African, Latin American, Middle East countries, you just are not going to get your goods into that country unless you do that. It is a normal way of doing business. And you've no more corrupted that individual than you've taken a trip to the moon. Well, in our effort to revise that law, we were called supporting bribery and corruption. You know, I appreciate your point. I would only say in partial defense that indeed it is in contradiction. But it's a contradiction we have accepted. It is a contradiction that should not result in schizophrenic behavior, however externally it may appear to be. We have to do it. And I think most Americans want us to do it.
Thank you very much. I think that the honest man theme is appropriate. The Undersecretary has given us what I think are very frank answers to interesting questions. It's been a good evening. Thank you very much.
On behalf of the trustees of the council, I think we all ought to give